Estelle, an elderly woman, was exploring an online dating platform in search of companionship. Meanwhile, Brian, an older gentleman, utilized the same criteria as Estelle, leading to a mutual match. They arranged to meet at a bar, where their conversation flowed naturally, eventually resulting in a lunch date at a cafe in London. During their initial discussion, they exchanged experiences regarding their disappointments in online dating. After an extensive and candid dialogue, Brian revealed that his true name was Roy Courtney, and Estelle confessed that she was also using an alias, her real name being Betty McCash. Their date progressed swiftly, as Betty's grandson, Stephen, arrived to pick her up. Stephen, who was pursuing a PhD in history, always made time for his grandmother and was pleased to see her with a new companion. Following Betty's departure, Roy promptly ordered a taxi, not to return home, but to meet three individuals already waiting for him: Vincent, his investment partner, and two investors named Bryn and his associate Joe. Roy and Vincent presented an investment opportunity to Bryn and Joe, inviting each to contribute €100,000 into a joint account, totaling €200,000. They were promised a 50% return within 6 months, and if they agreed, they would be introduced to Russian investors prepared to invest €800,000. At that moment, Roy felt elated as he received another message from Betty. Once again, he was asked to meet that evening. During their encounter, they viewed a film that explored Germany's history. However, upon completing the film, Roy suddenly experienced severe pain in his leg. A few days later, Roy and Vincent were seen organizing a meeting with the Russian bosses, Bryn and Joe, who were set to invest in a joint account totaling €1.1 million. Initially, the discussion proceeded without any issues, with Vincent and Roy acting as Brandon and Joe's financial advisors. The Russian investors expressed interest, indicating they would contribute €800,000 for a more favorable return. However, just as the funds were about to be transferred, Bryn made a joke about Putin, which rendered the Russian bosses silent. They glared at Bryn and subsequently departed, losing interest in the investment due to his inappropriate comment. Later that afternoon, Roy unexpectedly encountered Betty, who expressed concern for his injured leg and offered him a ride to her home, which was modest yet inviting. They enjoyed each other's company until Stephen arrived, confused about why his grandmother had invited someone she had just met. He insisted it was time for Roy to leave, prompting Roy to feel uncomfortable and eventually depart, with Betty and Stephen giving him a ride home. Roy's apartment was a small room on the top floor, and Stephen, who was initially cold towards him, felt a twinge of pity for his situation. Ultimately, Betty scolded Stephen and decided to invite Roy to stay overnight. The following morning, as Roy sat outside Betty's house, he noticed a suspicious Audi that appeared to be watching the premises. The driver seemed to be fixated on Roy, prompting him to return inside. There, he overheard an argument between Stephen and his grandmother concerning Roy. Although Betty attempted to maintain a facade of normalcy, Roy sensed the underlying tension and made an effort to ease the atmosphere. Roy's actions to initiate conversation led Betty to perceive him as a very charming individual. Conversely, Stephen appeared to oppose his grandmother's perspective. Subsequently, Betty requested that Stephen accompany Roy wherever he went, a request he found difficult to decline. Roy then expressed his intention to visit a friend from his youth at the hospital, a friend who had lost the ability to speak but could still hear. When asked if he would like to join, Stephen declined, opting instead to wait in the car. Upon entering the hospital, Stephen promptly exited, only to discover that Roy had exited through a back door shortly thereafter, having removed his coat. Roy walked with ease, displaying no signs of leg pain, appearing fit and healthy. He then proceeded to attend a second meeting with BR and Joe, the Russian investors, hoping to finalize their investment without complications, unlike a previous encounter. As a gesture of goodwill for his earlier jest, Ferran announced that both he and Joe would increase their investments by €100,000 each, raising their total capital to €400,000. The second meeting unfolded smoothly, leaving both parties satisfied, as well as Roy and Vincent. However, the atmosphere shifted when one of the Russian bosses unexpectedly embraced Bryn, leading to the alarming sound of police sirens outside the building. In that moment of tension, VR discovered that the Russian boss he had hugged was wearing a wire. The situation spiraled out of control, forcing everyone to flee the premises. Joe and Bryn were the first to escape, but once they had left, the tension dissipated, revealing that it had merely been a performance. Roy and Vincent found amusement in the antics of their companions, while the Russian bosses remained aligned with Roy. The balance of €400,000 belonging to Bren and Joe was promptly withdrawn by Roy. Subsequently, Stephen transported Roy to Betty's residence, behaving as though nothing had occurred. Afterward, Stephen departed to return to his campus. Meanwhile, a suspicious Audi was once again observed monitoring Betty's house. Roy sensed something amiss, as an unfamiliar individual persistently surveilled the property. Not wishing to keep this information to himself, he confided in Vincent, who cautioned him against frequent outings, fearing that a sniper might be targeting him. However, Roy felt provoked, particularly since he intended to visit a butcher shop owned by a Polish individual, accompanied by 3 hired thugs. He and Vincent went there to address a complaint from the butcher, who turned out to be the Russian boss responsible for scamming Bren and Joe. The Polish butcher expressed to Vincent that he deserved a share of the proceeds rather than a mere payment for his involvement in the scheme. Roy believed that €200,000 would suffice, but the Polish butcher rejected this offer. Consequently, Roy instructed his bodyguards to crush the butcher's hand using the meat grinder present in the shop to ensure his silence. Following this, Roy invited Vincent to Betty's house to pique her interest in their investment. When the time came, Roy and Vincent pretended not to know each other beyond Vincent's role as Roy's financial advisor. In a surprising turn, Roy boldly declared his intention to include Betty in his inheritance, displacing his only son, Robert, whom he no longer valued. However, Betty declined the offer, stating that she had enough. When the discussion shifted to assets, Roy inquired about the total value of Betty's holdings, and to his astonishment, he learned that her total assets amounted to €2.5 million. Vincent commenced his explanation of the investment opportunity he was presenting to Roy, noting that Roy possessed assets valued at €1.3 million. If these assets were combined with Betty's, the total would amount to $3.8 million within a year, with each party expected to receive a profit of 35% based on their respective shares. However, Vincent's presentation failed to capture Betty's interest in investing. She believed that having liquid funds readily available was more crucial, particularly given her age and the potential decline in her health. Upon hearing Betty's concerns, Roy concurred, emphasizing that his primary priority was to spend quality time with her. Betty responded with a light laugh, reminding Roy of his leg condition. Shortly thereafter, Betty was startled by an individual who peered through the kitchen window. Roy sensed a threat, particularly due to a suspicious Audi that had been monitoring their residence and the person who had just intruded upon their privacy. Meanwhile, Vincent remained focused on persuading Betty to consider the investment, a goal that aligned with Roy's desires. In the midst of their discussion, Stephen unexpectedly returned home and voiced his disapproval of the investment, particularly since it was proposed by someone his grandmother had only recently met. He argued that if the investment were legitimate, they should allow his grandmother time to contemplate it rather than pressuring her repeatedly. Betty was taken aback by Stephen's remarks, feeling hurt by the harshness of his words. Ultimately, Vincent departed, feeling disheartened by the unfolding situation. Betty began to feel increasingly at ease with Roy during a particular occasion when she offered to give him a haircut. However, before she could complete the task, she stumbled and experienced difficulty in standing. It took Roy a considerable amount of time to notice her predicament, but fortunately, Betty was able to consult her regular physician afterward. The doctor diagnosed her with a potential risk of stroke, which was concerning given her age and vulnerability. This news was equally troubling for Roy, who was finding it progressively challenging to persuade Betty to invest her money. Betty became even more resolute in her decision to refrain from investing, opting instead to save her funds for potential future needs. Following this incident, Betty unexpectedly invited Roy to join her on a spontaneous vacation to Germany. The day before their departure, Roy accompanied Betty on a shopping trip to prepare for the vacation. Betty expressed that she felt more at ease during the vacation than when she was merely at home. Unbeknownst to them, they were being observed by Bryn, who had discovered that Roy and Vincent had deceived him and was now seeking retribution. Aware of Bryn's pursuit, Roy quickly suggested to Betty that they enter a nearby shop, claiming he needed to use the restroom. In reality, he intended to divert Bryn's attention. Then made his way to the subway station, where he continued walking until he reached a dead end. The only CCTV camera in that area was intentionally positioned to overlook his movements. Once the situation was secure, Roy confronted Bryn and forcefully pushed him onto an oncoming train, resulting in Bryn's immediate death. Roy then exited the station nonchalantly and even gave his coat to a street performer. Shortly thereafter, the police arrived at the subway station, while Roy emerged casually just in time to reunite with Betty. With no one watching them, they were free to enjoy their vacation in Germany the following day, where their primary objective was to meet Stephen, who was conducting research on German history. Roy appeared perplexed when he occasionally heard Stephen explaining matters in German. Nevertheless, despite his confusion, he found amusement in observing artifacts from the country's history. Upon returning, Roy opted to rest at the hotel. Betty, who had just returned from a stroll, was not in the best condition. She had accidentally fallen and injured her palm while outside. Roy promptly attended to her injury, and his care and affection deepened Betty's feelings for him, dispelling any doubts she had about him. In summary, they returned to England, and unexpectedly, Betty expressed her willingness to invest, a decision she made independently. Vincent soon met with Roy, who was busy organizing his apartment to consolidate his total assets, which amounted to $1.3 million. He planned to withdraw the entire sum that Betty had invested. Vince suggested that he should at least retain a portion of her assets, given Betty's less than ideal condition, but Roy firmly stated that he was solely focused on enjoying the money while sipping champagne on the beach. The day of the meeting arrived, and both Betty and Roy were prepared to sign the waiver. Vincent reiterated that their funds would be deposited into a single account, accessible only to the two of them through a keypad that could be taken anywhere. Betty was to receive a larger share of the investment returns. Initially, everything proceeded smoothly. However, Betty soon began to question whether she should invest all her money, considering her health issues. To reassure her, Roy was resolute in investing all his assets, confident in Betty's complete trust, and promptly transferred all her funds into the mutual account for the password. Vincent requested 6 letters that both Roy and Betty agreed upon. Betty appeared to be particularly drawn to a flower painting featuring a lily, which led to the formation of the 6 letters, Lilies. This day marked a moment of great joy for both Vincent and Roy, as Betty remained unaware that they had deceived her earlier that same day. Following their meeting, Roy promptly gathered his belongings, intending to leave Betty's residence, citing a visit to his son Robert after receiving a call from France. Betty graciously accepted his departure, and in a bid to reassure her, Roy expressed that he felt more at ease with her, which seemed to persuade her further. Betty's affection for Roy deepened, leading her to believe he was a true gentleman. In a brief summary, Roy settled into his new apartment in France, spending time alone. Although Vincent had yet to receive his share, Roy indulged in champagne within the confines of an empty room. However, one day, he found himself in a state of panic when he could not locate his keypad. After an exhaustive search yielded no results, he contacted the bank, only to be informed that he could not access his account without the keypad. This situation perplexed Roy, as he could not fathom having forgotten it. Reluctantly, he decided to return to Betty's house to investigate. Arriving in the dead of night to avoid raising suspicion, he discovered the house was deserted, save for Betty, who was seated in an empty room. To his astonishment, Betty was in possession of Roy's keypad and was in the process of withdrawing €50,000 from his account for each deception he had told. Remarkably, she had meticulously tracked all of Roy's lies since the inception of their conversations. Betty had uncovered the truth about Roy's fabricated son and had discreetly taken his keypad before his departure. She understood that the sole reason for his return was the keypad, as it was unlikely he would come back merely to see her. Furthermore, Betty revealed her true identity, disclosing that she was not actually Betty. Upon the establishment of their joint account, the password they devised, referencing the painting of Lily that was prominently displayed, served as a clue revealing her true name, Lily, a German. It suddenly dawned on Roy that he was not actually his true name. His real name was Hans, also of German descent, which made it implausible for him to be unaware of the German language. At the age of 15, Hans received an invitation from Lily's parents to teach her English, as he had been proficient in the language from a young age and hailed from a wealthy family. Hans was aware that Lily's father had a notorious past as a Nazi criminal. Initially, their interactions were pleasant, but everything changed when Hans witnessed Lily's 3 older sisters dancing in the music room. They were significantly older than him, and Hans, unable to resist, secretly entered the room. His presence was quickly detected, and one of the sisters invited him to join in the dance. At that moment, Hans felt an unsettling attraction towards one of the sisters, and his lingering gaze made her uncomfortable. When he saw Lily, who was captivated by him due to his English-speaking skills, he committed an unthinkable act. He assaulted her. Shortly thereafter, the commotion drew the attention of Lily's mother, who summoned Hans to account for his actions. In response, Hans fabricated a story, claiming that Lily and her sisters had instigated the disturbance. Consequently, Lily lost all respect for him and refused to communicate, merely observing as her father expelled Hans from their home. However, 2 days later, Hans defamed her father, leading to his arrest. Unable to endure the turmoil, Lily's mother took her own life, and her sisters perished in an explosion during the war. Meanwhile, Lily managed to escape to England, surviving as an illegal immigrant. Lily provided an account regarding Stephen, who had earned a PhD in history many years prior. She had tasked him with investigating Hans's background 5 years ago, well before her own acquaintance with Hans, following a traumatic incident from her childhood. Consequently, the details of Hans's actions were disclosed during their initial meeting. It was also revealed that Stephen was not her grandson, but rather the boyfriend of her actual grandson, who had been the one to suspect the men in the Audi scene outside their residence. As for Vincent, he had been coerced by Stephen regarding his past crimes, which led to Vincent distancing himself from Hans. All communications from Hans to Vincent were promptly relayed to Lily in detail. The injury Lily sustained in Germany was connected to her deliberate visit to her former home, which had been converted into a charity for children. She entered what had once been her bedroom, now a library, and discovered a particular tile that contained a significant item. In her haste to open the tile, her hands were scratched by exposed nails. Inside, she found a strand of Hans's hair, which she had collected when she cut his hair during a previous encounter. A subsequent DNA test confirmed her suspicions that the man before her was indeed the individual who had devastated her family and her life. Her fainting episode during the hair-cutting incident was staged, and even the doctor who diagnosed her was a hired actor. In reality, she was in excellent health, even more so than Hans. The reason for her feigned illness was to incite Hans to invest heavily, allowing her to withdraw all his funds. The design of her house was intentionally crafted to mislead Hans, creating a comfortable and inviting atmosphere that portrayed her as an easy target for deception. Hans quickly pleaded for forgiveness. However, Lily assured him that she had already forgiven him. She then returned a keypad to Hans, intentionally leaving only 100,000 euros in the account while transferring the remainder to an inaccessible account before her departure. Lily had brought along 2 guests, Joe and the Polish butcher, whom Hans had previously scammed. The remaining funds in the account were insufficient to settle their claims, leading to a night filled with Hans's anguished screams as he faced a brutal beating. In summary, Vince was later spotted at the hospital, en route to visit Hans in his room. Hans was rendered speechless, having faced the consequences of his actions. Vincent offered him a glass of water, instructing him to imagine it was champagne. The room was adorned with a beach backdrop, and during this final visit, Hans was made to experience a semblance of his desires, as if he were sipping champagne on the beach, albeit in the most dismal manner. Meanwhile, Lily thrived in the company of her extended family, finding joy in the presence of her grandchildren, which reminded her of her sister. If you enjoyed this video, don't be shy to hit the like button, and if you disliked it, hit the dislike button twice, just to be sure.